Hello, literacy leaders and champions. Welcome to Literacy Talks. We are so excited to welcome you to this podcast series from Reading Horizons, dedicated to exploring the ideas, trends, insights, and practical issues that will help us all improve our professional practice in teaching reading. Our series host is Stacy Hurst, professor at Southern Utah University and chief academic officer at Reading Horizons, where reading momentum begins. Joining Stacy are Donnell Pons, a recognized expert in literacy and special education, and Lindsay Kemeny, a Utah-based elementary classroom teacher. Today's topic, decodable text. Let's get started.
The topic this week is going to be one that I think has a lot of layers to it and a lot of dimensions. And because of the way reading looks in the United States today, we need this resource more and in more environments. And so it's going to be an interesting conversation about decodable text. And typically, if we're talking about decodable text, that might seem not that exciting, but in the world of reading, it is really exciting. And it's a critical component to what you do as a reading teacher. And now that being a reading teacher is all grades, and it can be beyond high school. What's our access to decodable text and what does that look like? So this should be, I think, a very interesting conversation. We can get the ball rolling here. But first, Stacy, I'm going to toss it to you and just kind of ask you, because you do a really good job of distilling things. Tell us a little bit about what is decodable text.
I would say the tenets of decodable text, it's text that we use typically with beginning readers, beginning reading instruction, and it should be tied very closely to our phonics instruction or what we're teaching for decoding. I do teach my students that if they are approaching that kind of text the way it has been written in the past and expecting to take away a philosophical message about life, that's not going to happen because decodable text is not literature. So defining what it is and what it isn't. Personally, I have seen the power of using decodable text with beginning readers, and I do think of it in a sense like training wheels. It's something that helps us on our way to being able to read automatically and proficiently anything.
Yeah, I mean, it's excellent. Thanks for giving us that little sort of background on decodable text. And then, Lindsay, I'm going to toss over to you because in your classroom, you're right in the heat of it. Lindsay's sitting in those classrooms every day with students. Tell us about decodable text and what it looks like in your classroom and how you utilize it with students and maybe even with households. If you're helping parents with decodable text and having them, what does that look like?
I love decodable text. And that was a big transition in my classroom when I started learning about the science of reading. And really, that's one of the things that made me start questioning how I was taught, because my first year of teaching kindergarten, the books that were provided to me were not decodable texts. They were predictable, repetitive texts. It was things like, let's clean out the kitchen. Let's clean out the garage. Let's clean out the laundry room. The only way for the students to read those texts was by looking at the picture and guessing or predicting from same thing to me, memorizing the pattern. And so when I saw that, when I was first teaching kindergarten, I was like, I want them to practice their letter sound knowledge. I want to show them how they can read now that they have learned their letter sounds. And these books were not doing that. And I felt like they were giving the wrong idea of what reading is for these students. So then I wrote a grant to get decodable books in my classroom. And I just remember the first time I had this little boy, he had dyslexia, or has, I guess. And I remember him reading that little decodable book and he goes, Mrs. Kemeny, I'm actually reading the words. And he was so excited. I wish you could hear his little voice because he was just thrilled. So it was awesome. There's so much I could say about decodables,
right.
But yeah.
And Lindsay, you made some really good points, some really interesting things that came up when you were talking. That whole idea of guessing and having students guess, because what it is that the words we've all seen them too, the repetitive sentences, but the students aren't necessarily taught the words within those repetitive sentences. So like you say, it does promote this idea of look at the picture and guess. The idea of memorizing the words by size that are the same, right? But you're not necessarily really understanding those words and taking them apart. So you made some really interesting points there. And then I was just thinking to the work that I do with older students, that I typically work with students that are middle, high school, and adult. that did take away. The only thing they did remember from those experiences when they were younger and struggling with reading and not getting the help that they needed was to guess. And they're still doing that as adults, right? And as older learners and older students.
Yeah.
And the power of that decodable text, as you say, the young guy in your classroom that for the first time, he's got a decodable text because he's been taught the skill. That's the other critical piece that you pointed out, is that it goes along with your teaching. And so the student's been taught the skill, and then he's able to use the decodable text to practice the skill. And it's interesting is I'm able to kind of scratch around and find decodable text that a student that's a little older maybe would be okay reading, because a lot of it, as you say, it's very difficult as you get older. Stacy pointed out this isn't deep literature, right? And the older you get, you may be less patient with something that isn't deep literature. So that's the challenge for the older student, is finding a text that is still decodable so they can have those opportunities. And Lindsay, when you said, I wish you could see that young guy in my classroom, I get to see that young guy only as the older, unfortunate student that never had a chance to decode a text and be able to read for the first time a sentence where they could take apart every single word and understand it in the sentence. Wow. I'm sure it feels like you do looking at those younger students. So we're both seeing the power of that decodable text.
Yeah.
Stacey, I want to
just interject too, when Lindsay was talking about that student, and I have had, of course, similar experiences when I taught first grade, but one heartbreaking experience I had based on the type of text I had access to, the same as Lindsay mentioned, it was leveled readers. And I had in my first year of teaching a student who was repeating first grade. So already he was showing signs of struggle. And I remember he was very aware that all of his friends had moved on to second grade and he was in first grade. And we were a couple weeks, maybe a few weeks into the school year. I had conducted one of my guided reading groups, and he read I'm saying that with air quotes, he read a book, and it was very repetitive. I think it was along the lines of, this is an apple, this is a banana, this is a watermelon, this is a pineapple. That forced him to look at the picture to do that. And so knowing what I knew at the time, I praised him for that. And I said, you just read that whole book. And he looked at me, and you could tell, I don't know that he was convinced that he'd read it, but I think the important thing was that he didn't have a clue of what that felt like, because he looked at me and he said, great, does that mean I can go to second grade now? Conversely, I was reading with an older struggling student, and in elementary terms, older means third, fourth, or fifth grade. And the student was in third grade and had been exposed to that level text his whole school experience. His third grade teacher told me he was on a kindergarten level, so level C as the level text went. If I could help him out, read with him, see what was going on. So she gave me a book on that level for him to read, but he'd been on that level since kindergarten. It had the word elevator in it. I remember that. And I remember thinking, I'm not going to use this book to get a sense of what he can do. I knew what they were learning in phonics. So I used a decodable reader with him. And he was such a reluctant reader, and he didn't even want to read to me at all. And he was a very quiet kid, but definitely determined to not read. And so I bargained with him and I said, I will only have you read 2 pages. That's it. And we can stop. And he looked at the book as struggling readers do, kind of like, okay, well, it seems to be like there are 5 or 6 words on a page. I guess I can struggle through that. Right. But as he started reading, he was actually reading the words. He got to page 4 and I was having this internal struggle because I had promised him we'd only have to get to read 2 pages and he was already on 4 and just going. And so I did stop him and I said, oh, I promised that you would only have to read 2 pages. You're on page 4. And so, we probably should stop. And he said, no, I want to keep going. And I had the teacher, when I told her about it, she said, I've never seen that level of excitement with him. He came back to class and said, I read a book. That's the power of that. It's so tied to motivation. We talk about decodable text as not literary or kind of, boring for those of us who are proficient readers. But for those beginning and struggling readers, it has a lot to do with life and motivation for reading.
Yeah, it's opportunity, right? It's opportunity to be able to get into the text. Lindsay, I wanted to come back to you because you're, again, in this interesting space. And I wanted to ask, what is the relationship that parents have to you as the reading instructor for their children? Because Stacy and I, we kind of chatted about this a little while ago, where the teacher in the classroom says, it's my job. I'm going to teach your student to read. But what relationship do the parents have with that? And do the parents have a role to play with decodable text too? What are your thoughts?
Well, definitely students can use more practice. I love to involve my parents by having them support their readers at home. And I feel like I do the heavy lifting. So I'm not going to expect them to teach them anything new or, this goes like to spelling, but I'm not like going to send home a spelling list and expect my parents to teach them. The same as I'm not going to send home a passage and that's way too difficult for them, I guess. But I do involve them because I have, kind of this homework system, and I've shared a video with them and some training and how to kind of work on fluency with their student. But some of my students are not ready for our normal second grade fluency passages. So for those ones, I'm sending home a decodable passage because they need practice with their automaticity and getting their blending, more automatic. So I definitely involve them that way.
Yeah. Gosh, I love hearing that, Lindsay. And I love hearing that you're putting out videos and like you said, you're doing the heavy lifting, but there's a lot of information that can be shared with parents to enrich that time that they spend with their student, make it the most that they can, right?
Right.
And then I also love the differentiation, understanding that some of your students will be doing this activity and other students would be doing this other activity, and you're allowing for that.
Yeah.
And then Stacy, I wanted to get back to you too. This is because you're in an interesting space now that you're teaching soon to be educators, right? You're in a university setting and you're teaching those who are anxious and we hope hungry to be teachers in classrooms. You're giving them this valuable information, and I would love to be a student in your classroom today. I mean, what a great experience. What is their take on decodable text? And have you talked about it yet? And what does that look like at the university level before they've even entered a classroom when you're kind of having this abstract conversation about decodable text?
They're well prepared for that conversation because we started with, among other things, an understanding of the simple view of reading. And I think that's a very important way to frame this, because when we're talking about those two aspects of that equation, it is decoding and language comprehension. And the level text that I was using before I knew better was very much supportive of language comprehension, but not reading and not decoding. And so my students actually have a much better framework and place to file that kind of text than I did. The conversations I've had with students in the past, that's when I start seeing the shortcomings in my pre-service education, because I think I didn't have the framework, the place to put it in, and the understanding that it's a scaffold, and that eventually we want our students reading any text that is in front of their eyes accurately and having access to the meaning of it, like you mentioned, Donna.
Yeah.
A lot of my students have memories of Bob books specifically.
Yeah.
But they don't have a lot of memories of actual and decodable text. They don't share that. But the level text, absolutely, they remember.
Yeah. Lots of memories of that. That's so interesting. And Stacy, I'm so glad you made that point, to have that foundational understanding, to know where to put this, where to place it, have it make sense to those who are going to use it in their classrooms. And I love hearing about what your students are receiving in your classrooms. They're going to be so ready to hit the actual classroom and teach students. I think that's fantastic. It made me also think about the space that I work in, where I have this unique opportunity where I have students who have already moved along in the education system. They're considered to be, and I'm going to air quote, readers, right? Because we've all seen this struggle to read in the United States, and how my students are kind of, they've got a foot in each camp. I'm trying to help them to be able to provide that educational background and understanding of how we read in order to do it correctly this time, to give them their foundational building blocks. And so we need the opportunity to do that. But at the same time, they're spending their day having to access text they don't have the skills for. And so that's really kind of interesting, that compromise of the middle, high school, and adult who really needs the opportunity to back the bus up, receive the foundation that they needed, and spend time using those skills with text that's appropriate for the skill that's been taught. But then also during the day, they're being asked to access reading that is well above where their skills are right now. So that's a really interesting, I kind of want to chit chat here a little bit on this section here. Taking those lower grades, you can give us an interesting perspective, I'm hoping, is transitioning the student from the decodable text into other text that's now not as controlled or as decodable.
Decodable text, Think of it as training wheels for reading, and it's a crucial component to reading as we've been exploring today. There's more to discover about the journey to reading proficiency. To stay up to date on the latest insights and tips from the Literacy Talks podcast team, sign up today for our newsletter by visiting readinghorizons.com/literacytalks.
Well, I think the first thing to remember is that you are not only exposing the child to decodable texts. Even in kindergarten, that's not the only thing. You're making sure that you are reading them authentic literature, right? And having those discussions, working on that other side of Scarborough's rope. And so now I'm teaching second grade. So let's say my students that are well below benchmark and they're in decodable texts, that is not the only text they're reading. So they are still with us when we're doing our whole group and they're being exposed to the second grade. It's complex text for them, but they are reading with a lot of scaffolding. So we're reading it all together. They're following along. We're doing choral reading, echo reading, finally partner reading after they've had those scaffolds in place. So I think it's important that they're being exposed to many different kinds of texts. And then I will also add that I love the idea. I have a lot of different decodables in my classroom, and I love the idea that some of them are less decodable because I feel like that can transition them. I have some that are heavily decodable, 95% decodable, and I have some that are 80%. And I love those because that's transitioning them into regular text.
Yeah, gosh, Lindsay, I love that. I appreciate you giving us that little background about all the texts that your students are being exposed to. And Stacy, what do you want to add too?
It just makes me think from the moment you asked that question that as a, country, that sounds really broad. We need to have more conversation about the formulas for those decodable texts and keeping things like that in mind. Yes, we know that it should be tightly connected with phonics instruction. We know that. We know that to be able to comprehend what you're reading, that you should be able to decode at least 95% of the text accurately and fluently. So we know those things, but then how do we transition? How do we support readers in text that is less decodable, to use the word? And I loved too that Lindsay mentioned that we always want to be exposing them to the next thing, right? So in making that language rich, the three of us have had many conversations about this. On that formula level, there are so many different formulas for decodable text. I remember in my school, we got a basal program and they had you get so many materials. And for teachers, it's kind of like Christmas at first because you open all the new things and so many books. And they had a whole 4 boxes of books that were labeled decodable readers. And I thought it was interesting. So I opened them up. And what they meant, they were calling them decodable readers, but they were high frequency word readers. And so just having those conversations on a grander level and, appealing to researchers who are passionate about this to help us really refine what we know about how to create that text.
Yeah, I think that's so great. Thank you, Stacy, for breaking that down and giving us a reminder about how we even come up with a formula to make something decodable. And Lindsay, both of you have kind of made me think about the students that I work with that are middle, high school, and even adults in the workplace. But I haven't mentioned having a husband who has dyslexia. And then, of course, I went on to have 2 children who have dyslexia. One of them struggled more than the other. What was interesting in watching my husband, because, of course, when my husband, I discovered he had dyslexia, we were newly married. I didn't really even know what the term meant at the time. And it was a whole journey that changed my life, right? The whole focus of my life. And what was interesting is my husband found it as we started to dive more into trying to help him to become a better reader, because he had never, ever become a reader that felt confident or comfortable reading. And we figured he was probably reading about end of 3rd grade when we got married. But it was interesting because he started using the same books our children were using. And that was really his first beginning before we got into a program to really give him a systematic exposure and help him with his reading. But he picked up those beginning readers our children would bring home, and he wanted to do that reading with them every night because that was something, the decodable text was something that he found he could do, right? Even before we knew to teach and then have the decodable text linked, there was a real comfort there that this is something I can do with my children, and I'm going to be able to pronounce these words. I can actually read this with my children. And he read all the kids would start. So we had 4 children, and he did the first child. He did all the reading with that first child and used the decodable text. He did the second child, did all the decodable text, picked up the third child. He was in there every night, nightly, using that decodable text. And then, of course, we got him a reading program later. But, it's been, 20 plus years now since we've been working on his reading. And he just mentioned the other day how important those experiences were for him to have a book he could pick up and read with his kids. And he said, and I knew what it was. I wasn't kidding myself. I wasn't reading Tom Sawyer to my child. It was a decodable text. But he said it was the first thing I was actually able to read with confidence.
Wow.
So it's a really interesting conversation we're having about this text.
Yeah, and that's a powerful story, Donnell. I love that.
Yeah.
We've been talking about this in my class in regards to being able to read proficiently and know you're doing a good job at it.
Yeah.
And we have made the analogy between learning to drive a stick shift, how it is clunky and you worry that you're going to wreck the car or not be able to get started at a stoplight. But once you know how to do that, ironically, driving a stick shift becomes automatic to you, right? You don't even think about it. And it's really a complex process. And I think decodable text kind of helps students get to that point without the fear and anxiety that can be associated when you're not doing something the way you see other people doing it seemingly effortlessly. So I wondered too, Donnell, about, as you were talking, younger learners do not care that you're handing them a book that is highly decodable. And I've worked with adult learners too. Usually they were learning English and more than happy to use my first grade text to learn to read in English. But then you have those students starting probably about 4th or 5th grade that are highly sensitive to, if you put that kind of text in front of them, it's going to make them look like they don't want to look, right? So how do you approach that with your students in that age range? I would put it somewhere between, 4th and 5th grade and high school, all through high school, and even into college a bit.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And, this is a really interesting question because when I first started working with older students, I thought this would be harder than it was. But as long as I was sensitive to their need to make sure not everybody was watching, so we had a certain level of privacy, they were okay with it. And even when I matched up groups, because I didn't have the luxury of having people be one-on-one, but I knew we were going to maybe have a group of 5 or a group of 6, and I made sure to match them up. And I spent a lot of time on that. I think that's an important thing about teaching reading in the older grades is to make sure you spend just as much time matching groups if you don't have the luxury of one-on-one so that their personalities fit as well as you can. And there's a comfort level as much as you can produce. That is as important as what you're going to teach, I find, with those older grades. But I found that they just loved the opportunity to be able to read. They didn't care what it was. And as long as I presented it as, you'll be here temporarily while we're learning the skill. If you're patient with me, you're going to see this pay off. And as long as you laid that framework and groundwork, they were thrilled. But it was interesting because, Stacey, I think they were as delighted as what Lindsay describes with her young readers too, as I saw with my husband. They were just delighted that they could get through a text and have read the whole thing, sometimes for the first time, right? And you're sitting in high school and that's the first time you've done that.
Yeah.
And there's definitely something to be said about, high quality decodable books because some of them, yes, what in the world? That makes no sense whatsoever, and I've had some of those. And then I've had other ones that are just beautifully written, actually, with beautiful pictures and interesting, engaging storylines. So I think don't just judge one book that you've read and just like, oh, I don't want decodables. There's good ones out there. Definitely.
You make such an excellent point. And we also today have the luxury of having a lot of really nice decodable text that's nonfiction or fiction. You can choose by subject, right? So like you say, high quality text as well as important.
I was just going to say with those readers in that interesting space too, I have 2 things. Just one, that it is worthwhile to have a very candid conversation with them. I know it's worked for me in the past to say, I know you struggle with reading and that is okay. And I'm here to help and nobody needs to know. I'm not going to announce it because they've been faking it for so long, right? Mm-hmm. They've been compensating. And so they know. And I think that's why you get the results you do, Donna, when you use decodable text that may be from a, 2nd or 3rd grade reading curriculum, because they know that I'm actually doing the thing now. I'm not faking it in this case. And then I think there are things we could do as an industry, anybody who's publishing these books for older learners, some of the best decodable texts I've seen for struggling readers in those middle grades look like a chapter book.
Yeah.
We can create it like that. I think they're going to be more likely to even carry it around and read it. I have so many struggling readers. And 2 students ago that I tutored, he was just into graphic novels because there were so many pictures that could support what he was reading, but also it was a thick book. His peers weren't going to look at him and say, "What are you reading?" All really important concepts. I think we could do better by them. And Julie Washington lately has repeatedly said a lot about decodable text for older readers.
Yeah, no, I love that plug. And the more that we can say it, because I'm all about it. When Dr. Julie Washington has said that at several conferences, and she'll tag it on even at the end of a discussion, if it's not part of a discussion, to say we really do need more decodable text for older students because we have more students in those spaces learning to read and they need the opportunities with text, right? And so we need that quality text, as Lindsay was saying, to make sure it's a quality experience that they're having with the text. And I wanted to say something too. Stacey, you brought up something interesting about graphic novels, because I love graphic novels. I've used them a lot in my classrooms, especially with older students. One of the things that one of my students pointed out to me years ago is, you need to remember that there's a lot going on the page in a graphic novel. And that's very true. Yeah. And he said, and oftentimes I don't know where to look. And a lot of times I don't know the direction. I'm still trying to figure that out. And they just assume that And he said, if I were a better reader, I probably would be able to figure that out. But he said, just when you hand me that, be careful. And so, Stacey, you've done a really good job of bringing us back around to making sure you set the groundwork for the text, no matter what it is, right? And that you have a conversation about what it is and make sure your students feel comfortable with it and that you're understanding their needs and not making assumptions. Just because it might feel good to me or look good to me doesn't mean it feels or looks good to my student too. Those are interesting things to talk about.
I love that. It made me think of that student I was talking about. I think the visually, you're right. There's so much going on in a graphic novel. And that as a genre in and of itself is pretty amazing. But we wouldn't want to limit anybody to one genre because it's more illustrated at that point. But this was a really interesting workaround from that student I was talking about. He would come to a word he didn't know in text. He would type it into his phone and then push in the Google search and push on the image option and then know what it was. And so his reliance on graphic novels, he was gathering information from the pictures. And you're right, they're not always left to right and they're kind of all over the place. And I really like that we're having this conversation because as any conversation that we have, we can keep having it. Mm-hmm. My takeaways are actually questions. So what can we do to make that kind of a decodable text for older readers who are struggling with reading or still developing that ability in a proficient way? What can we do to create that experience for them in a better way, right? What can we do better? And then also for younger readers, we're assuming a lot here. What could be done to make that even more effective than it is? And I think those are 2 big questions. And I hate to sort of end with questions, but what do you guys think?
Yeah, Lindsay, why don't you take younger? I'd like to hear.
I don't know, but I wanted to say one thing about why I loved another reason why I love decodable text is that I feel like they train the student to keep their eyes on the words and not guess. And it's just enough. I mean, we know the language in the decodable text can be just a little strange, even sometimes with our high quality ones, but I almost like that because they've really got to tune in. And it's just so common. Like I have this little girl in my class right now who's just, her eyes always going off and guessing the rest. And that's easier to do in a predictable text or even a level text. Those really smart kids can figure out the context pretty well. I was telling her today, have you noticed your eyes are staying on the words and now you're getting them right? And I love that with decodables because they have to tune in and it's good practice for them to decode a word all the way through.
Lindsay, I love that. I love you reminding us and looking at your student. So, a couple of things really came together there because you were watching your student, right? We're not making assumptions about what's happening. And you were able to pick up on that and then really make the decodable text what it should be for her, the experience that it should be. And it made me think about my older students and kind of that question you left us with, Stacey. I think it all maybe comes together. And very much for the older student, they need to have those experiences too, because you can imagine if you didn't get a great teacher like Lindsay, then you ended up going through the grades with your eyes darting around the room and trying to find the answer. And it was was okay to skip over and kind of miss. And so now as an older student, I'm now doing the Lindsay job in the classroom and saying, hey, let's look at this page. And I have words on this page that you've been taught how to take apart. So I know you're going to be able to read these words, and being able to bring that text into the classroom and the importance of it. And so I think, Stacey, the students who really do appreciate if they're being taught the skills that they need in order to use that decodable text and see the value of it, right? Because if they have never been taught that, they're not going to see the value of it. But they're always taught, so the students go right away, oh yeah, I see what we're doing. I get it. And then they're able to read and have those experiences they haven't had before. And then they know that you are going to be giving them many opportunities to not only read decodable text, like Lindsay said, but to have other opportunities with text, because you're always bringing that in and making it rich and asking them what they're thinking and what are they reading or what would they like to read, what's interesting to them, and having all of those conversations. I've just loved this conversation. I've loved hearing more about the younger grades as well, informing, and Stacey, about your students who are in a college setting that are going to be going into classrooms. I loved hearing about that. We could go on forever on decodable text, but it doesn't take this long to fill a few minutes. But this has been a great discussion. I appreciate being able to see those two aspects of it and look forward to having yet another conversation. And who knows what it will be next time.
Yeah.
Thanks for joining us today for Literacy Talks, the podcast series for literacy leaders and champions everywhere. Literacy Talks comes to you from Reading Horizons, where reading momentum begins. Join us next time.